Uh-huh.
I go back down to the back plate, right? Okay. So I'm gonna start from here and I'm gonna go under. Okay. Like I said, I'm gonna add a couple things, but this is where you want to go by. Make sense? Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Got it.
Okay. All right then. Tell me when you guys are ready.
Ready.
Okay. Now we're gonna go over the coupling, and we're how to inspect the coupling, and also we're gonna inspect the full trailer. Okay. So in case you guys get Form C, this is where you guys would start.
Form C.
Yeah, Form C. Okay. The first thing I would check for, check my back plate. I'll check my back plate. Want to make sure that it's not cracked. I don't have any cracked or damaged welds, and it's properly secured to the frame. The next thing I would check for is my electrical hookup. I'll check my electrical hookup. Want to make sure that it's not cracked. There's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured with a spring-loaded latch. From here, I would check my electrical line. I'll check my electrical line. I want to make sure I don't have any cut, burnt, or exposed wires, and it's properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my glad hands. I'll check my glad hands. I'll make sure that they're not cracked, they're not leaking any air, and they're properly secured. I'll also want to check the glad hands. I'll check the rubber seal. Want to make sure it's not cut, it's not dry rotted, and it's free of any debris. The next thing I would check for is my air lines. I do have red as my emergency line and blue for my service line. I want to make sure that I don't have any cuts, any leaks, and it's properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my pintle hook. I'll check my pintle hook. Want to make sure that it's not cracked. Want to make sure there's no loose or missing bolts. Want to make sure that it's properly secured in the lock position, and also that it's free of any excessive wear. The next thing I would check for are my D-ring mounts. I'll check my D-ring mounts. Want to make sure that my D-ring mounts are not cracked. I don't have any cracked or damaged welds, and they're properly secured. I'll check the D-rings. I'll check the D-rings. Want to make sure they're not cracked, and they're free of any excessive wear, and they're properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my hooks. I'll check my hooks. Want to make sure that they're not cracked. Want to make sure they're free of any excessive wear, and also they're properly secured with the spring-loaded latch. The next thing I would check for is my safety chains. I'll check my safety chains. Want to make sure they're not cracked. There's no cracked or damaged welds on them, and also want to make sure that I don't have any stretch links. The next thing I would check for is my license plate. I'll check my license plate. Want to make sure it's clean and visible. There's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured. I'll check my license plate light and want to make sure it's not cracked. I don't have any cracked, loose, or missing lenses, and they're properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my I-ring. I'll check my I-ring. Want to make sure that it's not cracked. Want to make sure there's no loose or missing bolts, and it's also free of any excessive wear. Next up, I will come to the tongue of my trailer. I'll check the tongue of my trailer. Want to make sure the tongue of my trailer isn't cracked. It's free of any illegal welds, and it's properly secured. From here, I'll go to my landing gear. I'll check my landing gear. Want to make sure that my landing gear lowers and raises properly. And want to make sure that my landing gear handle is properly secured in the stored position. I'll also check my landing gear base and want to make sure that my landing gear base isn't cracked or bent, and also want to make sure that it's free of any debris. The next thing I would check for is my storage bin. I'll check my storage bin. Want to make sure it's not cracked. I don't have any cracked or damaged welds, and it's properly secured. I do want to mention that I'll check for anything in my storage bin. Want to make sure that nothing's hanging or leaking, and everything is properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my header board. I'll check my header board. Want to make sure that my header board isn't cracked. There's no cracked or damaged welds, and it's properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my clearance light. I do want to mention that I have amber to the front, red to the rear. I want to make sure that I don't have any cracked, loose, or missing lenses, and that they're properly secured. From here, I'll check my D-ring mounts. Want to make sure that they're not cracked, there's no cracked or damaged welds, and it's properly secured. I'll check my D-rings themselves. Want to make sure they're not cracked and they're free of any excessive wear. From here, I'll check my floorboards. Want to make sure none are cracked or missing, that there's no loose or missing bolts, and that they're properly secured. From here, I will take the time to go under my trailer to inspect what I would inspect under my trailer. The first thing I would check for is my cross beams. I'll check my cross beams. Want to make sure my cross beams are not cracked. I don't have any cracked or damaged welds, and they're properly secured. The next thing I would check for is the frame. I'll check the frame. Want to make sure that it's free of any cracks and free of any illegal welds. Okay. From here on, right underneath my frame, I don't know if you guys can see them, I got my air tanks. I got 2 air tanks. I'll check my air tanks. Want to make sure my air tanks are not cracked, they're not leaking any air, there's no loose or missing bolts, and they're properly secured. I do want to mention that I'll drain my air tanks daily at the end of my day to prevent any moisture in the system. From here, I'll check my air brake hoses. Want to make sure that they're not cut, they're not leaking any air, and they're properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my dual air brake chambers. I'll check my dual air brake chamber. Want to make sure that it's not cracked, it's not leaking any air, and it's properly secured with the C-clamp. The next thing I would check for is my slack adjuster. I'll check my slack adjuster. Want to make sure that my slack adjuster isn't cracked, and I'll pull on it with the brakes released to make sure that I have no more than 1 inch of play. Next, I would check my push rod. I'll check my push rod. Want to make sure that my push rod isn't cracked or bent, and it's properly secured with the clevis pin and the safety pin. From here, I will come to my leaf spring mount. I'll check my leaf spring mount. Want to make sure that it's not cracked, there's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured. I'll check the leaf springs. Want to make sure that my leaf springs are not cracked, shifted, or missing, and they're properly secured. Then I have my torque rod. I'll check my torque rod. Want to make sure it's not cracked or bent, there's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured. From here, if you guys check on the other side where my axle's at, I have my U-bolts. I'll check my U-bolts. Want to make sure my U-bolts are not cracked, there's no loose or missing nuts, and also want to make sure they're properly secured with 4 nuts. Then I'll check my axle. Want to make sure that my axle isn't cracked, it's not leaking, and it's free of any illegal welds. From here, I'll come into my inner tire. I'll check my inner tire. Want to make sure I don't have any abrasions, bubbles, or cuts. I'll check my inner rim. Want to make sure my inner rim isn't cracked or bent and free of any illegal welds. I'll check my brake drum. Want to make sure it's free of any cracks, free of any debris or any fluids that could contaminate my drum. Then I'll check my brake lining. Want to make sure I have no less than 1/4 of an inch of brake lining. From here, I'll come to the top of my tires, check them from street to street to make sure I don't have any glass, screws, or nails, or anything that could puncture my tire. I'll check the tread depth. Want to make sure I have no less than 2 30-seconds of tread depth. Also want to make sure, and also I'll thump my tires daily to check for improper inflation, and once a week with the tire gauge. And these could be recapped. From here, I'll come in between my duals. And I'll check in between my rims for any daylight. There should be no daylight in between my rims because this is a bud system. I'll also check that in between my duals that it's free of any debris and also that my tires are not touching or rubbing against each other. I'll come to the outer wall of my tire and I'll check for any abrasions, bubbles, or cuts. I'll check my rim to make sure my rim isn't cracked or bent and it's free of any illegal welds. I'll check my valve stem. Here I do have two valve stems, my outer and my inner valve stem, and want to make sure that they're not cracked, they're not leaking any air, they're not loose, and they have proper clearance from the rim. I'll check my lug nuts. Want to make sure I don't have any loose or missing lug nuts. And I'll also check for any rust or any rust streaks that could indicate looseness. I'll check my hub oil seal. Want to make sure it's not cracked. Want to make sure it's not leaking, that there's no loose or missing bolts, and that it's properly secured. I also would check it to make sure that it's filled to the proper operating level. From here, I will check my suspension mount. Want to make sure my suspension mount isn't cracked, there's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured. I would check this set of duals the same way I check this set of duals. Would you like me to check this set of duals? If they tell you to move on, you would move on. Then I check my splash guard. Want to make sure my splash guard isn't cut, it's not hanging, there's no loose or missing bolts, and it has proper clearance from the tire. The next thing I will check for, my tailgate locks. My tail ramp locks. I'll check my tail ramp locks. Want to make sure they're not cracked or bent, and they're properly secured with its safety pin. From here, I got a rear clearance light, red in color. Want to make sure that it's not cracked, I don't have any cracked, loose, or missing lenses, and that it's properly secured. I'll check my tail ramps. Want to make sure that they're not cracked, there's no cracked or damaged welds, and they're properly secured in the closed position. The next thing I would check for is my tail lights. I'll check my tail lights. Want to make sure my tail lights are not cracked, I don't have any cracked, loose, or missing lenses, and that they're properly secured. I do want to mention that my tail lights function as my turn signals, my four-way flashers, and my brake lights. Also check my electrical wires for my tail lights. I want to make sure I don't have any cut, burnt, or exposed wires, and that they're properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my license plate light. I'll check my license plate light. Want to make sure it's not cracked, there's no loose or missing bolts, I have no cracked, loose, or missing lenses, and it's properly secured. I'll check my license plate. Want to make sure my license plate is clean and visible, there's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured. The next thing I would check for is my 3 ID lights, my 3 rear ID lights in the back. I want to make sure that they're not cracked. Want to make sure there's no cracked, loose, or missing lenses, and they're properly secured, and they are red in color. I would check this side of my trailer the same way I check the driver's side of my trailer, but I will name it different. On this axle, instead of having a torque rod, I have a torque bar. And I'll make sure that my torque bar isn't cracked. I don't have any cracked or damaged welds on it. There's no loose or missing bolts, and it's properly secured. And those are my differences for my trailer on this.
Torque bar, torque rod.
Boom.